Welcome, sir. How you
Hi.
doing, man?
I'm good. Are you
doing good?
Do you want to discuss with me, or am I doing like this by myself, or what?
I think you're doing this by yourself, but I'm cool to hang out for a minute.
All right. So what's up?
Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. I'm at Plan B. I'm eager to know. I know you kind of have a handful of maybe bad news about Bitcoin mining. Wait, are you sharing good news or bad news or both?
I don't know yet.
You don't know yet? You don't know yet? Okay.
Shall we just hands up if you're an FBI agent? Anyone?
All right, we got at least 2 or 3.
All right.
All right, cool.
Yeah, I'm feeling a bit weird thanks to you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome, buddy.
Yeah, uncomfortable breakfasts. Who's ever stayed at like a hotel with a bunch of Bitcoiners before at a widely publicized event, and got, seen some people walking around doing something and going, I'm not saying Bitcoin is infested with spooks, but the kind of movement Bitcoin is, it would be weird if this was the one movement that the CIA left alone and didn't fuck with us. So anyway, so I'm here to talk about the history of, or the evolution of mining pools. And I think I'll just talk about how Bitcoin started, really. So back in the day, Satoshi envisioned the whole thing as being, one CPU, one vote was kind of how he put it, right? And it was all integrated. Bitcoin mining was just, you ran a node, that was also your wallet. It wasn't called Bitcoin Core, it was just Bitcoin, that was it. There was nothing, it was just a thing called Bitcoin, a Windows GUI. Like, there was no Satoshi yet because no one even knew how many decimal points there were. There was no command line, there was nothing. Mining was just, what was the button called? It was like get Bitcoin. You pressed that and you would just mine. And the thing is, CPUs they're nice because everyone has a CPU and they're all pretty similar when it comes to their abilities to, roll double SHA-256, right? So everyone's got a laptop, everyone can mine Bitcoin, and Satoshi said, let's just have a gentleman's agreement not to use hardware that would actually be better at this, because the more specialized the hardware gets, the more centralized mining gets, and that's what happened, right? We moved over to GPUs, and the network difficulty, which was going up and up and up, suddenly turned into a flat line, because it went, yoop, when we moved over to GPUs, and then we did the same with FPGAs, and then we finally moved to the best thing you can have, which is ASICs, which are application specific, right? And that's a loaded term. Some people will want to tell you they're not application specific because that's how you get some regulators off our back, but they are, right? All these machines do, all an S19 does is roll SHA-256. That's all it can do. And that necessarily centralizes things a lot because that's not a CPU anymore. That's a $10,000 device you've got to buy that does a very specific thing that's very obnoxious that you can't have in your house and is necessarily only going to be manufactured by a very small group of people. In fact, you basically have one manufacturer, Bitmain, responsible for around 85 to 90% of that hardware. And you can tell how centralized and awful things have become in the hardware space because it's backdoored, full of bugs. They've been exploited before. It's all closed source. Even the jailbreaking versions of the firmware you can install on them, they're closed source as well. And no one would tolerate that in the actual HODL space where you have, Bitcoin nodes, right? No one would run a closed source backdoored Bitcoin node. That would be insane. We wouldn't be able to make any claims around decentralization. But that's what it's like in mining. And that was the trend for a long time, and it's only gotten worse. But that's hardware, right? So how does this relate to pools? Well, pools, thankfully, are, and I will call them a necessary evil, and I'm going to uncharacteristically celebrate what's happened. Normally it's all doom and gloom with me, but not today, because pools are actually pretty useful. The minute you had this specialization occur, where everyone was the people that had the money to invest, do the research and development, because, the hardware manufacturers are going to do a lot of mining themselves, right? And demonstrably, they kind of sell substandard hardware to the wider community. We've seen that in action. But the point is, the way Bitcoin works, it makes sense to pool your rewards and split with other people. if you can find one block a year and you can find 12 other people that can find one block a year and you can work together, then you can get paid once a month instead of once a year. You'll get a 12th of what you expect, but you get it 12 times more often. That's a no-brainer. That's an electricity bill you can pay instead of not pay. So the tendency is for people to pool together. And the question really comes down to, all right, let's go through the history of it. Let's talk about how it went from the start. So you had the first pool come around, which was Slush, and then you had a whole mishmash of protocols and ideas that people had for how miners are going to talk to each other, and how do we think forward and stop this from becoming centralized. And we, compromised and ended up, settling on the worst possible thing, which was something called Stratum. And then we embarked on a 10-year journey trying to come up with Stratum v2 to fix all of our problems. And I'll get more into protocols in a minute, but Stratum v1 was about as bad a protocol as anyone could possibly think up. It's plain text, it's super inefficient, and it necessarily centralizes everything and puts the pool in as much control of everything as possible. But that was how it started, right? That was Slush Pool, and then the emergence of other pools, and we had a sort of slow coagulation towards just what we kind of see now, which is pools had a life cycle, right? They would come around, they would go, and I'll get into payout mechanisms in a minute because that's basically the most important aspect of what I'm going to talk about here. Hopefully I remember to come back to it. There's one other topic we definitely need to cover. But pools would sort of grow and grow and grow, and naively they would label their own blocks, and everyone would look at it and say, all right, 51% attack is what we need to be careful of. If any one pool makes it too close to 50, that's bad, and we all switch our hash rate and move somewhere else. And to our credit as a community, that happened, and we responded as we should have responded, which was great. So ghash.io was a great example of that. A pool from a very long time ago. It got into the 40% range. Everyone was a cypherpunk back then. It wasn't a bunch of blue-pilled North American cucked, publicly traded companies that do everything the regulators tell them. We were cypherpunks back then, so everyone just left. But we were also a lot more naive when we were running the pools. ghash.io was happy saying, hey, we're finding 40% of the blocks. And everyone went, you're finding too many, so they left. And the result of that is death spiral. And that's actually more risky now because of the modern payout mechanisms where death spiral is just staring every pool in the face. So currently today, the situation we have is where pools pretend they aren't as big as they are, which is awful because people are very happy being complacent. You have the dominant hardware manufacturer in the industry, which is Bitmain. You have them in this unbelievably powerful position where they can flaunt their power and say, all right, it's closed source, it's backdoored, what are you going to do about it? And every miner goes, I hate this, and buys, invests $10 million buying their equipment. But I'm not going to point it to Antpool. I'll point it, which is Bitmain's pool. I'll point it to another pool, which is just Antpool under the hood, but at least it doesn't look like Antpool. So there was some research done. I work for Ocean. We're a mining pool, and I'm going to get why we're doing what we're doing. But after we launched, we found out that it's actually a lot worse than we thought. We launched because we were motivated by what's going on with pools, and then some research came out that wasn't done by us that showed, wait a minute, there's at least 10 pools on this pie chart that are all just Bitmain under the hood. All of the payouts coming out of the blockchain are all going into one pair of hands. And all of the block templates, which is the decision around what goes in Bitcoin's blockchain, is all being done by one actor. And it's just being presented differently. It's being presented as though there's a whole bunch of different players. So there's nothing worse than the illusion of decentralization and us falling for it, which is basically what's happened with mining pools. And I guess, rather elegantly, I can come back to the payout mechanisms because that's primarily what's responsible for this. FPPS was what we've come to, and what is now we've peaked, and we're finally saying goodbye to that era. So I'll rewind and go back to the history of payouts, right? So initially, the way it worked with pooled miners was everyone would mine together, they would split rewards, and naively it would just be whatever the hash rate split was at the time we found the block, that is how we divvy up the payments. So supposing you're 20% of the hash, you're 20% of the hash, you're the remaining 60% of the hash, we just divide it like that. It doesn't matter what was happening before that. It doesn't matter what happens after. Unfortunately, someone found a way to attack that pretty quickly, and it was called pool hopping. So in any environment where you're pooling with other miners, the attack went like this. If the pool finds a block, you immediately start mining on that pool right after. Then if the next block is a lucky block, you get a disproportionate amount of money. The minute you reach 100%, which is something you descend to, right? If I find a block as a pool and then I find another one 1 minute later, that's, hundreds of thousands of percent lucky, and it falls down the more time expires, right? And once you get to 100%, this is when we should roughly find a block on average. Once you fall below 100% and you're in an unlucky round, you abandon the pool and let other people deal with the bad luck, right? Because they're just losing money at that point. Every single pool that opens themselves up to that attack is just going to die unless all their miners are ideological or something. And you can't rely on that, right? So that was pool hopping, and then we had to come up with more sophisticated payout mechanisms like PPLNS, where we say, right, pool hopping isn't going to help you because your payout is based on an average of what you've contributed over a set time period or a set number of shares. And that was great, but miners still were too high time preference for that, sadly, because you still had to wait for blocks to get found, and if the pool went unlucky, sure, there was no advantage of leaving the pool, right? Because you would never get the corresponding advantage if you joined during a lucky round. People just were incentivized to stay, but it wasn't good enough. Miners wanted to get paid money that didn't exist, which is just utterly high time preference and as fiat as you could possibly imagine, but that's what emerged as the dominant payment mechanism, and it's unbelievably centralizing because someone has to bankroll that. And that's what happened. PPS, PPS Plus, FPPS. And all FPPS means is, I, as a liquidity provider, I'm going to give you money as a miner no matter what happens in the blockchain. I'm going to give you a free lunch. And a lot of miners were happy saying, sure, I don't see any snag with that. And unfortunately, the amount of money required to maintain something like that, to have a deep enough pocket to say, I'm on the hook for $50 million to my miners today, and we didn't find any blocks because we got unlucky. To have pockets that deep basically means everyone ends up with one dominant player's, control over everything. And that was why we saw that centralization that we saw with all the small mining pools, because all of their miners were telling them, we need to get paid no matter what. We got bills, man. And the pools could either say, look, we can't pay you money from blocks that didn't get found. That is literally money that doesn't exist. We can't print it. This is not fiat. But we can give you money based, we can give you regular income if you want. But that's an expensive product. Offering to pay people money that doesn't exist is extremely expensive because you have to be able to write out the variance yourself. And what we saw was just a general disconnect. And if I can just sort of zoom out philosophically, the miners just had nothing to do with the blockchain anymore. You were just getting paid money and you were hashing, but you didn't know if you found a block. You certainly didn't care about what went in the block. And whether the pool could reconcile what it had paid you or not wasn't really your concern. You look at this number, 2% they're charging me. Is that a realistic number? Absolutely not. And then when Ocean came out and said, look, man, we're PPLNS, or Tides, which is a derivative of PPLNS, we had some conjecture saying we're probably going to pay miners a lot more because we're not a middleman between the blockchain and the miner. If you're 50% of Ocean, every time we find a block, you just get 50% of the rewards. We don't have to have this expensive product we offer you where we're going to pay you no matter what. The analogy I've used for this a few times is like if you can either be a farmer and grow crops, or you can pay some middleman that guarantees you a certain amount of tons of corn every year, and they promise that no matter what. And intuitively, I'm sure you can all grasp that if someone ever offered you that, you could very trivially just assume, if someone is offering to give me a set amount of crops grown from a field, no matter if there's, a volcano erupts and ruins the sky for a whole summer and there's no growth, they're going to have to cover their own ass, they're going to have to offer me an incredibly low amount in order to be able to sustain that. So if someone's coming to you and saying, I'll pay you for your hash rate, no matter what happens on the blockchain, there's increasingly that is just an impractical thing to do without taking a huge cut. So yeah, Ocean came out. We found out there was a lot more scandal than we thought. We thought we were justified in coming around and decentralizing Bitcoin mining. before we found out how centralized it had become, we were trying to be preemptive in it. It turns out we're now trying to keep Bitcoin's head above water here. So FPPS really is the thing that's been the main villain in the story here, because miners did all become super high time preference. They wanted payment no matter what, and they didn't want to do any verification, and they didn't insist on that from their pools. So the pools were saying, we're going to pay you this much money for your hash rate, and that's just what you're going to get. And people would do comparisons, and in theory, competition could kind of make the whole thing work, right? Because if there's enough pools, if one FPPS pool is charging you too much for the product, you're going to switch to another one, right? But that doesn't work, where you basically have Bitmain bankrolling the whole thing, who can afford to do it because they're the ones selling ASICs. So you have them, and you basically have Foundry, and they're responsible for more than 50% of what goes in the chain. They're both fully KYC'd, they're fully compliant, they're proud to be, and none of the miners on those pools care at all. So that is Bitcoin wide open to regulatory capture. And there's nothing you can do about that. When it comes to, advocacy of certain principles, cypherpunk ethos, even voting for politicians that come out with friendly rhetoric like Trump, that's not going to be helpful, because all they're going to do is further construct a regulatory moat that makes it great for the miners that will do everything the government tells them. In a rational universe, which everyone is going to disagree with here, you vote for Kamala Harris and hope that she punitively treats miners as badly as possible just to make everyone start mining in their garage again. That's actually how you do it, but no one would ever vote for that, because they're either too high time preference or just not complete masochists. But the only way you can, it's true, the only way you can have a Second Amendment, I always use this analogy, is if you have a tyrannical government you're trying to get away from. Otherwise, people just don't see the point. Which is, again, Bitcoin's been it's been kid gloves with Bitcoin. Nothing's really happened to it. It's not punitively treated. Like, there are countries like Japan and actually Italy where they're charging 45% capital gains or even unrealized gains. But in North America, they haven't done that. In fact, they've done even worse. In Canada, they charge miners that want to solo mine or interact directly with the network in some capacity get charged twice the taxes in Canada. Whereas if they want to use some sort of financialized middleman style mining approach, the kind that Foundry offers, they don't have to pay the sales tax anymore. So it drops to 15% instead of 30%. That's literally the kind of compliance we see publicly traded companies like Riot celebrate, right? They're like, we've gone to Washington and we've gotten favorable treatment. We've got our taxes lower. And I'm like, yes, but what's the asterisk on the end of that? It's if you do mining the way the government wants you to do, it's cheaper, right? That is not a resilient Bitcoin. That's a captured Bitcoin. You need permissionless mining. You need it to be without KYC, and you need ultimately miners to accept variance again. You need them to adopt a low time preference mentality again, which moves them closer to the source. And the source itself is random, right? If you want to buy Bitcoin, you're going to watch your net worth lose 80% of its value every 4 years, right? In some horrific bull crash, right? But you don't get the wins if you're not prepared to do that, right? You have to accept the volatility. It's just the same with mining. If someone says, I'm going to offer you Bitcoin investment, but I'm going to shield you from the volatility, you'll just get the gains without it. What gains are you going to get? It's the same as the farming analogy I use. You might see some derivatives product that gains 5% a year and doesn't even outpace inflation, right? If you want Bitcoin, you've got to grab the bull by the horns. Same with mining. But here's the silver lining in the whole thing. So FPPS was always destined to fail, because Bitcoin, fortunately, has this just free miracle where every 4 years the subsidy halves. Once upon a time, you could predict as a miner exactly what you were owed from your hash rate, and it was impossible for pools to throw dodgy dice, right? And the pools could also make better predictions about what they bring in, so they could operate with narrower margins. 50 Bitcoins every 10 minutes was how Bitcoin was for 4 years. And you can see what the network difficulty is, you can infer the overall hash rate from that, and you can look at your own machines and say, right, I should be making 3 Bitcoins every week. And you can infer that easily. But then we had a halving, and Bitcoin dropped to 25 Bitcoins every 10 minutes, with a sprinkling of transaction fees. Not enough really to matter yet and to make things less predictable, But then we halved again, and we halved again, and now you have between 1 and 10% of what miners bring in from the chain being transaction fees, and those are completely unpredictable. So how are you supposed to go and sell your hash rate to an entity that will pay you no matter what, when the actual reconciliation that entity does is completely unpredictable, and it's only going to get worse every 4 years? The conclusion is FPPS is not sustainable. In order for us, as a centralized purchaser of all the hash rate in the world that smooths out all the variance for the miners, in order for us to maintain that, we have to, running low on time, we have to allow ourselves a wider and wider margin. We can't be on the hook. During the halving was a good example, right? There were blocks that had millions of dollars in transaction fees in them, but that only lasted a short period. If you as a pool have to pay out on an FPPS basis, which, by the way, I haven't explained yet, means I pay you what you should be getting based on a network-wide average of what the blockchain is bringing in, even if I don't find any of those lucky blocks. So as an FPPS pool, even if I'm like having average luck, if another pool finds a block with a fat finger transaction fee in it, like someone accidentally pays 83 Bitcoins as a transaction fee, another pool found it, that raised the price of shares, and I have to pay you out based on that, even though I'm never going to get that in from the chain. And accidents happen, attacks happen, everyone's operating below 100%, but we have this illusion that we're paying out based on an 100% reconciliation that actually just never happens, right? There's holes in SHA-256, man. Like, we look at these things like they're completely iron solid, right? But every output in the SHA-256 algo is not achievable by any particular input, right? Like, the SHA-256 algo is supposed to have every single output be possible with some theoretical input between 0 and 2 to the 256 minus 1. But in reality, we know that if you go far enough with it, once you have enough zeros at the beginning of the block header, you start running into the fact that there's a subset of numbers within that range that are actually not achievable with any input. What does that mean long term? It means miners all start having 90% luck on average. They can never reconcile to 100. So FPPS has to kind of take stuff like this into consideration and just pay miners less and less and less. And this is what I mean by silver lining. It slowly started to reconcile lately where miners are just going, this is too expensive for us. Yeah, I get paid every 24 hours consistently, but versus a pool like Ocean, I'm paying now between 10 and 20% premium just for having someone smooth out the payments for me. That's too expensive. And as I said with the halvings, as transaction fees become a bigger and bigger percentage of what miners bring in from the chain, or what pools bring in from the chain rather, it gets even worse and worse and worse, because pools are ultimately going to have to start paying their miners or making promises for smaller and smaller amounts. That's just necessarily what's going to happen as the income becomes less and less predictable. It's like predicting weather. It's like predicting price movements. You can make long-term guesses, right? I can tell you that in 50 years, transaction fees will be higher than they are today. But I can't tell you tomorrow if there's some shitcoin launch on top of Bitcoin that makes op return fill every block for 4 hours and then we go back down to normal. Can't predict stuff like that. And FPPS as a payout model can't survive in that environment. So we've seen what that payout, that thirst for high time preference, fiat-oriented mining has given us, which is all of the small pools gave up. We demonstrably had pools that were PPLNS that said, we can't maintain this anymore. We need to switch to FPPS. Everyone is leaving us. Miners hate dealing with variance. They just want to get paid no matter what. They did it, and they had to get bankrolled by the parent pools that had other sources of income or just had deep enough pockets. It trends roughly towards 30% you need to be in the best spot you can for FPPS. If you're only 1% of the network as a pool, you're in a bad spot. You can very quickly go bankrupt, promising miners money when you're dealing with randomness of blocks. So that's pretty rough. And again, to return to the silver lining, they've just said, we can't do this anymore. We can't keep making these promises. We're having to skim so much off the top to protect ourselves and not go bankrupt during an unlucky round. And miners have just begun leaving as well. Miners have said, all right, this is too much. So Ocean came out and said, we don't want to act as a middleman. We will pay miners more. And it was funny because we were mired in controversy when we launched because we were going to exclude certain transactions from the blocks we made. And this hello to the spam war, which is a lot of fun, and it was all launched by Unhosted there. You launched the entire thing, believe it or not. Thank you, thank you. I'm going to make you all clap for Unhosted. I'm going to make you do it. Clap for Unhosted. Yeah. So yeah, anyway, the assertion made by many people that I used to have a lot of respect for in the space was that this was censorship, and I'm going to do a debate with Luke and Peter Todd and the other Pete from Bitcoin Magazine in like 5 minutes on the WAGMI stage. It's a very relevant part of mining pool history because we were pulled in two directions at once. When we launched, we were the centralized makers of block templates, and we had a different opinion about what those should look like. And rather ridiculously, we had data carrier size, which is a variable that allows nodes to decide how much arbitrary data they want to allow people to make or to add with transactions, and we had a lower amount than what Bitcoin Core has. And somehow, between the number 83 and the number 42, it becomes censorship, and it was never really clear where the ideology begins and reality ends with that. But I spent a year arguing about it, and it wasn't a very fun year, and hopefully we can have it out here and just never talk about it again, because it's really stupid. But so that whole thing happened, and the assertion though was, look, miners aren't going to use your pool because they're going to earn less money. And then we just went, okay, here are the numbers, and Ocean stats are public. So if you're a miner, you can look at what you've mined on any other pool and compare it with any miner on Ocean that has roughly your hash rate, or anyone consistently mining, and extrapolate if you need to. We were paying more than 10% more, and everyone went, how can you make that claim? And a couple of pools went, you guys are absolutely full of shit. And that was a couple of months ago, and they never, ever elaborated. I remember I'm going to call it out because it's fun. The CEO of Lincoin was like, Ocean are lying. They're absolutely full of shit. They are not paying more. I'm going to prove it. That was 2 months ago, and he's never commented on it again. And it's not hard to understand why. Because his pool and all others like it act as a middleman, and middlemen take a cut. Ocean doesn't do that. So it's not an outlandish claim. It's very intuitively understandable. If you get rid of the middleman between you and the chain, you will make more money. But also it requires you adopting more sovereignty, right? Ocean not only is more lucrative for miners, but we're here to decentralize template construction. And I haven't really spoken about this enough because it should be the focus of what we're talking about. Mining pools, their primary function is to split rewards between all of the miners. That's all a pool is really supposed to do. But pools have been taking custody of everything that comes out of the chain, and they've been making all the decisions around what goes into the chain. Now, Bitcoin needs to be censorship resistant, and I mean real censorship resistant, right? I'm not talking about mempool policy or arbitrary data filtration. I'm talking about governments coming to centralized creators of block templates and saying, you can't put this in the chain anymore. Russian Bitcoin exchange, Iranian Bitcoin exchange, you're not allowed to put that in blocks anymore. That's realistic in Bitcoin at the moment because you have more than 50% of templates being constructed by 2 actors. And that's because there might be millions of miners pointed at those actors, but those actors decide what's in a block template unilaterally. And that's not good enough. So Ocean came around and said, miners, we need to push this out to the miner level. Miners need to be the ones deciding what goes in the chain. That's what we did with the launch of Datum. And as I will celebrate the Stratum V2 guys, I don't have any interest in picking a fight. I will also point out, though, that it's been around for 10 years, and it's supposed to have done what Ocean did in a few months. Jason, head of engineering, wrote a protocol from scratch called Datum, and now 70% of the blocks mined on Ocean were made by the miner, not us. So I'm extremely proud of this, and it's a fantastic protocol, and it's a fantastic protocol, and it's manifestly working already, right? So people are labeling their blocks, miners are proud of what they're doing, and importantly, if Ocean were to grow to 40, 50, 60% of the network, there isn't a lot anyone could really do by coming to us and trying to impose censorship on Bitcoin. We don't have... Ian's in the audience, I'm not going to say it. All right, sorry, that's our legal department. We don't know who our miners are. You can read between the lines on that one, right? We don't know who they are. All we know is their Bitcoin address. So if someone were to come to us and say, look, you can't include these transactions, we're going to say, we didn't, our miner did, and here's his Bitcoin address. And that's all the information we have. And that's what Bitcoin needs to be censorship resistant. And I'm proud to say Ocean, with 0.3% of the network hash rate, has totally changed the game in that regard, massively. And not only that, that's what goes in the chain, but what comes out of the chain is another thing we bust wide open. In the entire year of 2024, all newly generated Bitcoins went to around 70 addresses. That's it. Around 45 of those were mining pools paying themselves a rare sat or ordinal, which is, we can forget about all that. Around 20 or 30 were a P2 pool block that got found. Sorry, P2 pool, I didn't get enough time here to mention you. Definitely an honorable mention. Ocean came along and we found a block that paid out 70 miners in the Coinbase transaction. We doubled overnight the amount of people getting Bitcoin directly from the network, which was another massive accomplishment that I'm really proud of. But unfortunately, I've run out of time. Thanks so much for listening. If you're a miner, definitely look into earning more money and picking up your sovereignty again and interacting directly with the network. If you don't do that, we all suffer and you earn less money. So there's every reason to, take on a bigger burden as a miner and make more money as a result. So thanks so much. And yeah.